Hey folks, and welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review. And today one of those reviews where I'm kind of sitting awkwardly behind a massive oversized box, and on this occasion it's because I've got here in front of me the OAD Ultrafidelity Preamp called the Padma. Now you'd be forgiven if you've never heard of OAD Ultrafidelity, particularly if you're outside of Australia, because OAD Ultrafidelity is an Australian brand that's been making power amps and preamps for a little while now, but they're a brand that I personally had never heard of because I spend most of my time in the headphone space. John from OAD recently reached out to me to see if I'd take a look at the Padma, even though it's not normally my sort of product, because it can still apply to the world of headphones, as I'll talk about soon. To put this into context though, this is a 7,000 Australian dollar, so that's going to come in at roughly around about 4,000 to 5,000 US dollars if it were available overseas, which I don't believe it currently is. But contextually, it's in that 4,000 to 5,000 US dollar range, or 7,000 Australian dollars thereabouts. And it's a dedicated preamp normally used for hi-fi speaker setups. If you're not familiar with preamps, that means that this guy would sit after your DAC and before your power amplifier for your speakers. John was kind enough to lend me this one to give it a go to see what I thought of it as well. And so let's jump in now and share with you the qualities of the OAD Ultrafidelity Padma Preamplifier. Obviously, as a headphone-based reviewer, reviewing a product like this was a little bit tricky, but the good thing about the Padma here is it's designed in such a way that it can actually drive headphones directly from the rear outputs. Now technically, it's not designed to drive headphones, but because of the way John from OAD has designed this to be largely immune to the interconnect you're using, and I'll explain that one shortly, because of that design, it's got enough driving power to drive any headphone I have here, including the Susvaras, believe it or not. And so just to give you some context for how I've approached this review, as a non-power amp, non-speaker user, what I've actually done is tested this preamp by connecting it directly to a range of headphones to test for things like transparency, general sound quality, etc. And I've also run some headphone amplifiers from it to see how it performs with those high impedance inputs from things like headphone and power amplifiers. For me, the key feature that I would want from any preamp is generally about transparency. And so that was very much my focus and why I thought it was suitable to test with headphones. Because realistically, what I was looking to find out here was whether or not the Padma imparts any sonic character to the sound, whether it manages to maintain all of the resolution coming from the DAC, and therefore whether I found it to be transparent, easy to interact with, and easy to use. The short answer to most of that is yes, but I will get into more detail. But before we do, let me give you a quick idea of what the Padma's offering. As a preamp, it's got the volume control on the front because that's what the preamp's designed mostly to do. And it's also got 6 inputs in this case. You can see the 6 buttons along the front. And so if we turn to have a look at the back, I can show you just what the Padma is capable of in terms of inputs and outputs. This is a seriously heavy and large piece of equipment, so I apologise that I can't actually get it in position for it to be fully in focus here on the camera, but as you'll see in the Glamour video that I'll show in a second, there are plenty of inputs and outputs available. What we've got going on here is 3 pairs of balanced inputs and 6 unbalanced, and what that means is that 3 of the inputs you can choose to use it balanced or unbalanced, or single-ended if you want to call it that, and then 3 of them are purely single-ended. For each of those inputs that could be single-ended or balanced, you've got a switch next to it to tell it which mode it's operating in, and then other than that, you've got some outputs. Specifically, the outputs that you've got is your regular volume-controlled outputs that would go to your power amp normally, and for that we've got both single-ended and balanced, both of which work regardless of the input type you're using. In other words, if you're running single-ended in, you can still take balanced out. But in addition to the main output, you've also got a home theatre output. And the reason for that is that you might have this in a system where you've got dual purpose setups for 2-channel listening and then also for your home theatre listening. And for home theatre, you've most likely got that going through some kind of surround sound decoder. If that's the case for you, then what happens with the Padma is that when you switch it into standby mode, it's going to bypass all of its volume circuitry, etc., and just send the feed straight to these home theatre outputs. And so essentially the way to think about it is when this is on, when it's active and you're using it, the only outputs active are the two for the actual Padma output. And then the moment it goes into standby mode, it's going to activate those home theatre outputs. So it does give you the versatility to have this in a multifunction setup should you want to. It also means that if you're using this in a setup where maybe you've got a different amplifier with integrated volume control, then you could just switch this one into standby and have those home theatre outputs going through to your integrated amp. So there's a good range of versatility available from the Padma, and when we're talking about features and benefits and functions, there's a couple more tricks up its sleeve that are worth talking about. The first things I should mention is the output power and gain that this provides. And the Padma will give you a gain range of everything from minus 63 dB when the volume control is all the way down, up to positive 9.7 dB at maximum volume. The Padma is also rated to output over 20 volts RMS at maximum volume, but keep in mind if you are thinking about the fact that I've used this with headphones, that doesn't mean it's going to be capable of driving a full 20 volts into a low impedance load, because it's designed for the high impedance inputs of power amplifiers. Now I don't know exactly what the current output of this is, as I said it seemed to very comfortably drive the Susvaras, and it's probably worth talking now about why that is. The reason John's designed this to have so much voltage and also a fairly significant amount of current output is that according to John it makes it more immune to the types of interconnects you use. And much to my shock, that's actually pretty true. I tried the Padma setup with a pair of really high quality Supra Sword RCA cables going into one input, and a pair of crappy homemade XLR interconnects using just regular RJ45 solid core Ethernet wire for my XLRs. Now normally when I do a comparison like this, there is a vast difference between the sound of them. But with the Padma at play, I actually had a hard time telling the difference, and at one point because the sound quality was so similar, I actually got confused as to which input had which cable connected to it. Now going back and forth, I do think there was a slight difference between the cables, but with the way the Padma's designed, it actually managed to minimise the impact of those connections. And what I mean by that is it got to the point where I don't necessarily know that I would 100% say that the Sword cable sounded better so much as a little bit different. And that's a pretty big achievement when we're thinking that I was using pretty crappy, cheap RJ45 cable for the XLR interconnects up against a properly designed, with the right geometry, right cable and wire structures internally, a properly designed RCA interconnect for the other input. Now, according to John, the way he's brought this about is by actually giving the Padma here the ability to drive through things like capacitance, inductance, etc. So every single cable that you can connect to a device like this, both the incoming inputs but also the outputs as well, going to your power amp, each of those cables has resistance, inductance and capacitance. All three things that can make it more difficult for the preamp and the power amp to transfer the signal. By designing the Padma to have plenty of driving power, John said that it makes it less prone to be influenced by things like inductance, capacitance, etc. Now I don't know enough about the detailed technicalities to say exactly how that's working, whether it does or doesn't work for all three things, resistance, capacitance and inductance. But what I do know is from my listening test, it certainly minimises the impact to the point that it's almost irrelevant which interconnect I tried. And that's a pretty cool thing because it means you don't have to spend thousands and thousands of dollars to get the absolute best sound out of a device like this. I personally probably would still choose to use an interconnect that's a bit better than my RJ45 cables, but even so, it does go to show that you don't need to spend a fortune to get great sound with the Padma. While we're talking about immunity to different cable types, the other thing that John claims is that the way the power supply is set up on the Padma also makes it pretty immune to what sort of power filtering and power cables you might choose to use. And I have to say, in my testing with that one, it was a bit tricky because the Padma goes through this quite lengthy power-up routine, which I'll talk about in a moment, and it did make it difficult for me to quickly compare different power cables and using filtering or not filtering, but I do think that I was hearing a slightly better quality sound using a Supra power cable from a Supra power board, as opposed to a standard generic power cable from a generic power board. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that the difference was massive and that you absolutely have to use high quality power cables and filtered power boards, but I do think for me that the power was a little bit more variable than it was with the interconnects. But all of that's a bit of a tangential side note, so let's talk about two things that really matter here, and that is how well the volume control works, because that's ultimately what a preamp is doing for you, but also what the sound quality is like. The volume control on the Padma has been very, very carefully designed by John based on my conversations with him, and specifically what he's implemented here is a very precise and very controlled resistor ladder style volume control, but the actual control of it is done digitally. This volume knob on the front is connected up to a magnet which senses the position of the volume control, so there's no direct connection here to a potentiometer or a stepped attenuator. This is giving a signal via a sensor in the back of the device to a very precise digital control. That digital control allows precise movement through the resistor ladder, and that gives us 0.5 dB steps throughout the volume range. A big part of this design is that it allows the actual control of the volume to happen all the way here down the back of the device, and that means that John's been able to minimize the signal path so the signal comes into the inputs and has the shortest possible path you can create from the input through the volume stage and out the output. It also allows the Padma to have far less components in the signal path, and that theoretically should improve transparency of sound as well. A couple of really interesting things about this volume control, given that there's no direct connection to anything other than magnetic sensor, is that when you first switch on the Padma, having had the mains power all the way off, so this is not from standby mode, it's just when it's been absolutely switched off from mains power, when you first switch it on, it does this full cycle of scanning through the volume range to recalibrate the exact perfect positioning of the volume knob. That does take a while, so it's not something I'd recommend you do is switch this off at the mains too often if you want to use it quickly. And of course there is a standby mode from the remote control, so you don't have to switch it off all the time. But when you first switch it on with mains, it goes through this quite lengthy process of scanning the whole volume range before it finishes calibration and allows you to use it. After that, the magnetic sensor in there has also been tuned to provide just a little bit of resistance on the volume knob, so it feels like you're turning something tactile, it gives you a bit of feedback, and it feels really lovely to interact with. Of course, the other benefit here is it's also a motorized volume knob, so you've got full motorized volume control from the very solid and beautiful to interact with remote control. As you'll see on the remote control here, it's pretty simple. You've got power, volume up and down, input up and down, and a mute button, but it's lovely to interact with, everything's smooth, and the quality of this control is exceptional. It's solid metal, it's got this beautiful anodized kind of finish to it, and it's a really lovely control. One final thing I should mention about the volume control is that by pressing and holding the input button, you can also adjust the balance if you want to. The final thing I want to mention before we move on to sound quality, and I should have talked about this when we looked at the back of the device, is that everything going on in the Padma is fully balanced and fully dual mono. And so what that means is that the left and the right channels never meet. That's really important because it means that your left-right channel separation is absolutely maximized. And it means that if you are feeding a balanced signal in, then you're getting that balanced signal transferred the entire way through the amp, unmolested, to spit out the other side, still balanced. As I've talked about before, balanced isn't everything, but if you are using balanced interconnects to help reduce and reject any noise in your environment, it's nice to know that it's being maintained throughout. And so having covered all that ground, let's talk briefly about sound quality. And I say briefly because there's not a huge amount to talk about here. The key question, as I said at the beginning, is does this produce a transparent, high-quality sound that's faithful to the source further up the chain? And the short answer is absolutely. But as with any device in a source chain, it's not completely invisible, so let's talk about the character that it does impart. One of my tests for transparency is always to see how a device compares to the headphone output on the Chord Hugo TT2. The reason for that is not to suggest that the TT2 is the best product in the world, but it's got such a short and simple signal path from the output of the DAC straight to the headphone output that you really hear everything that's going on from that DAC output and can then compare other devices. By the time the signal's gone through a pair of interconnects and into a preamp like this, you can see what's been lost along the way. And in the case of the Padma, very, very little is lost. And in fact, I'd say some things are gained, not in terms of detail because you can't add detail in, but what is gained is a tiny sense of refinement to the sound. The output from the TT2 can be just a little bit dry sometimes, particularly depending on the headphones or the speakers you've got connected to it. And what I found was that with the Padma, everything was there, the tonality was exactly the same, but it just all felt a touch smoother or a touch more refined. And I don't mean smoother in terms of smoothed off or rolled off or any detail being lost, just that everything had a sense of refinement to it, as I'll talk about with a specific example. One of the tracks I listened to here was For Once in My Life by Harry Connick Jr., and I was listening with the DCA Stealth headphones driven directly from the outputs of the Padma, and of course driven directly from the TT2. And as a side note, if you're wondering why I've got the DCA Stealths here, having previously reviewed them and not being a huge fan, I've got a new pair here and my results with those are a bit different. So do make sure you subscribe and ring the notification bell if you want to hear my revised review of the DCA Stealths. But for now, using the new pair of Stealths on the Padma direct from the XLR outputs, What I heard when comparing to the TT2 was sound that was pretty similar. From the TT2, the sound is very clean, very detailed. I found that the TT2 presented a slight sense of attack from Harry Connick's vocals. Ever so slightly, there was a bit of sibilance on some of the consonants in there. The stage is pretty modest in size, but the vocals really nicely focused within that smaller soundstage. And interestingly, the piano in this track sounds quite dry and lacking in harmonics. It's almost like they've applied some sort of production to suck some of the bass out of the piano and keep it sounding quite thin. I'm not saying they've actually done that deliberately, but that's kind of how it sounds. And then when the string section comes in, there's two different types of string sound. You've got some short, kind of percussive strokes, and they've got a nice sense of texture and attack from the TT2. And then there's some more sweeping melodic moments later on, and those are very smooth. There's still a little bit of texture, but generally speaking, a smooth sound from the strings. Listening to that exact same track from the TT2 feeding into the Padma, and I was using the Super Sword RCAs for this. Listening to the same track now using the Stealths direct from the Padma, what I heard was a very similar presentation, but that little bit of sibilance in Harry Connick Jr.'s vocals was just tamed a little bit. I could still hear that it was slightly sibilant in the recording, but it was just a tiny bit easier to listen to coming from the Padma. The stage size was basically identical, the separation of sounds was also equivalent. I didn't get any sense of lost soundstage width or depth or image separation. If anything, the imaging might have been slightly better because everything was just that little bit more refined. It made each individual sound a bit easier to listen to. Because some of that sibilance was gone, my ears were able to relax and take in the background and the other instruments. All of it was just a touch easier. The piano still had that lack of harmonics and richness to it. And on this occasion, that's a good thing. That means that the Padma isn't adding in any extra harmonics or richness or warmth to the sound. It's just taking exactly what's coming through and giving a transparent but refined output. Those strings that I mentioned before still have that excellent sense of texture and attack, but then that smoother section is still wonderfully smooth and rich and just melodic and sweeping. Perhaps the strings had a slightly greater sense of richness in that smoother section, but it was very small of a shift, and the key thing for me was that I wasn't losing any of the texture in the textural parts, but I was gaining a sense of refinement and richness in the bits that were meant to be smooth. And we're also only talking very subtle shifts. We're talking 1 to 2% shifts here, and that's all I would personally ever want from a preamp. You don't want this colouring your sound significantly, and the Padma definitely doesn't. If I had to really separate the sound between these two, what I would say is that I think a little tiny bit of micro detail was lost with the Padma. I couldn't isolate a particular thing and say listen to the recording and listen for this, but as I went back and forth between the two, I was aware that there was a sense of extra very fine kind of micro detail texture that I felt like I was getting from the TT2 that I didn't notice as much from the Padma. To be really clear here, I didn't feel like I was missing anything from the Padma when I listened to it in isolation, but because this was about comparing the two outputs, the only thing I could really find that clearly separated the two was that super short and super simple signal path from the TT2 was just ever so slightly more revealing than the Padma was. And that's always to be expected because we're going from the DAC stage of the TT2 into the XLR connectors, via the connectors into the XLR plugs, from the plugs into the cable, from the cable into more plugs, from the plugs back into the preamp, through the preamp circuit, out the sockets on the back, and off to whatever your device is, be it a power amp or in my case a pair of headphones. And so all those connections, all that wire, all the circuitry in the Padma, all of those things are a place where you can lose the tiniest bits of detail. The whole point of products like this is to try to absolutely minimize how much of that is lost, and I think the Padma is doing a fantastic job of that. If I weren't in a position to flip between the two with the headphones direct out of here and the headphones direct out of the TT2, then I don't think I ever would have known a difference. And so for me, that's the proof in the pudding that the Padma is a wonderfully transparent and clean and clear sounding preamp. It's also wonderful to interact with. It feels beautifully made, not just because it's heavy, that's not a measure of quality for me, but because every bit of fit and finish on it is just beautifully done. All the machining is perfect and precision. The surface of the device feels lovely to touch, so the tactile experience is great when you're interacting with it. The buttons have a lovely sort of soft but tactile feel to them. Not soft in terms of spongy, but they're not harsh, they're not rattly. They've just got a nice, smooth press and a nice sense of tactility when you do hit that moment of actuating the button. The volume control has just the right amount of resistance and feedback for you. Really everything about this just screams of a premium interaction. And then the sound on top of it is beautifully refined, but very, very transparent and not colouring the music at all. And so for me, what I'd say at this point is that if you're in Australia and you're in the market for a great preamp, the OAD Ultrafidelity Padma should absolutely be high on your list. Now, anecdotally, it actually outperforms the much more expensive preamps apparently. I haven't heard those, so I'm not going to say that for sure, but I can absolutely believe those claims based on what I've heard with it. The levels of transparency and refinement are nothing short of fantastic from the Padma. If this was a headphone amp, it would be getting my absolute top recommendations and staying on my desk forevermore. But as it is, I'll be a little bit sad to send it back to John, even though it's way too big for my desk and isn't a dedicated headphone amp, because it's just such a lovely device. So again, if you're in the market for a preamplifier, I know that John is making these available in Australia. I'm not sure about New Zealand or other overseas countries. But if you've got any interest in this at all, then check out the OAD Ultrafidelity website. I'll put a link in the description down below. And contact John and see what's possible if you're outside Australia. To be clear, there's no kickbacks or affiliations or anything here. This is just a product that I've been introduced to and I absolutely love. John's also working on a pair of speakers that I hope to share with you soon as well. Even though I don't do a lot of speaker reviews, I think this one's going to be worth doing. And so as always, if you want to keep up with all the great stuff coming down the pipeline, make sure you subscribe and ring the notification bell. For now though, I hope you found this review useful and interesting. Hopefully I've introduced you to a wonderful new product you'd never heard of before, or maybe you'd heard of it and didn't know how it stacked up. And if you have found the review useful, I'd love it if you'd hit the like button. It really helps the channel out. For now though, let me leave it to the music, so happy listening and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.